Good morning to you. Thanks for being with us. I want to welcome in our panel. We start with the former Lieutenant Governor of New York, Betsy McCoy, senior contributor for The Federalist, Benjamin Weingarten, back with us this morning, and National Advisory Board member for Project 21, Christopher Arps, is here as well in a sunny downtown St. Louis. I should say, always sunny in St. Louis. Betsy, nice to see you again. Benjamin, nice to see you as well. I wanted to bring this up before we get into the situation down at the border. Rochelle Walensky is doing something that's not getting enough attention, or certainly not getting the attention that I think it should be getting. Take a listen to this.
As soon as our guidance came out, it became very clear that 6 feet was among the things that was keeping schools closed. And in that context, science evolves. So there has been one study that was published late last week that demonstrated in Massachusetts, where there's generally 100% mask wearing, that 3 feet was actually safe. Student rates and teacher rates of disease were the same in 6 feet versus 3 feet.
Okay, so I know the video is grainy. I still wanted to show it. What she's saying is more important. I'm going to set this up, Betsy, then we'll start with you. I know you wrote a great piece about this in the New York Post about how kids should be back in school, and it's embarrassing that they're not. But all of a sudden, 57 days after Joe Biden takes the oath of office, they have changed something that was fundamental to our lives for the last more than 12 months now. It is no longer 6 feet of social distancing. It is now 3. There were people that looked into where that arbitrary number came from, 6 feet. It turns out that it was more than a century ago. Some doctor came up with it as he was trying to prevent the flu virus from spreading. The number is, in fact, completely arbitrary. Betsy, I'll let you pick it up from there. But, you know, this changes everything. Restaurants could have had more people inside. Other venues could have had more people. It's just it's a slap in the face to every single person in this country.
Well, that's right, but it's particularly important for schools, and note that this announcement was made after the Congress passed the $1.9 trillion, quote, stimulus bill that includes $130 billion for public schools. Nobody was going to make this announcement before that, but it is key. Let me add, however, that in the issue of opening schools, pinning it on keeping desks 3 feet apart or 6 feet apart and opening the windows, which is what the CDC recommendation states, is really like going back 100 years. That guideline could have been written in 1950 or even 1900.
Betsy, that could have been written in 1820. The guideline is that there's no, it's that arbitrary.
It's not just arbitrary. You're quite right. It is arbitrary. But we also have the technologies now in our HVAC systems, in antimicrobial coatings for desks and chairs. So many ways to ensure that the virus is deactivated in the air, destroyed on surfaces. We could be making these schools much safer if the money were being used to actually apply those technologies. Instead, it's being used for teachers' vacations, teachers' salaries.
Yeah. No, you're
everything but making the school building safe.
Benjamin, it's good to see you. So the way I see it, so by the way, Dr. Fauci over the weekend, I did not want to play his soundbite just because, as I've said before, I'm tired of Dr. Fauci, but he's on CNN over the weekend, and one of the announcers, what am I talking about? One of the anchors says that a Massachusetts study has indicated that 3 feet of social distancing might be just fine. And Dr. Fauci literally changed course in the middle of the interview and said, well, yeah, 3 feet could work too. And it's like, what? I mean, think about how many restaurants. Yesterday was St. Patrick's Day. I had the general manager of Cheers in Boston on. We were talking about how many Irish pubs have been forced to close across the country because pub culture is, you're usually in there having a pint, you're close to other people. 3 feet is nothing. 3 feet that's the subway, that's a bus, that's everything.
I mean, first of all, the administration talks about Neanderthal thinking. Neanderthal thinking has been applied to the nth degree when it comes to our schools, where all of the evidence out there, all of the studies from the earliest dates that we have indicate that schools are not big transmitters, especially when you go to younger children. It doesn't pass among children. It doesn't pass from children to adults. So it's just absolutely asinine that we've created now a generational crisis of children not socializing in schools, not getting the obvious academic benefits that exist in schools, and beyond as a consequence of really pseudoscience. I mean, so much of this, look, the New York Times says essentially that the 6 feet number was figured out of thin air. First, there was, Dr. Fauci said, no masks. Now we're at 2 masks, maybe 3 masks.
Right.
The lockdowns themselves, when you look at the studies, show that pretty much the curves follow the same direction, curve downward, no matter when you instituted a lockdown or if you didn't institute a lockdown. So the reality is we should have no faith in our public authorities, and we should assume that most of these responses are political, not based on the science. And that erosion in public trust is going to have disastrous consequences down the road, but we've already had disastrous consequences.
You know what's interesting, too, is that when people say to me sometimes, and it's become political to say this, they'll say, well, you know, I follow the science, as if to say you don't follow the science, too. But they say that to sort of be like, well, you know, I don't know where you're coming from, but I follow the science. That's great, but what science are you following? Because if you're following Dr. Fauci's science or some of the science we've been fed for the last year, it's just bad science. And this just reinforces that again. Chris, behind you, you've got the St. Louis Arch, beautiful sunny day there in St. Louis. By this same arithmetic, and I've been up the arch in that tiny little elevator, by this same arithmetic, that means the arch could have stayed open the last year. We could have been 3 feet apart, taken that tiny little elevator up to that tiny little observatory, and we all could have had our masks on, and we all would have been fine.
Hey, exactly. You know, going back to the science always said originally that most of these transmissions were happening in very close quarters with people that live together, not in restaurants and in workplaces. You know, during the earliest stages of the pandemic, we were doing contact tracing. I don't know about you, but I don't think I saw many instances where restaurants were the cause of the transmission of the virus. Right. We could have been open a long time ago.
Yeah, restaurant transmission rate 1.4%. You make a great point. I want to pivot and talk about the border for a moment. Here's Joe Biden while he was campaigning to be president during one of the debates. Here is what he had to say about how he would handle immigration. Take a listen.
I would, in fact, make sure that we immediately surge to the border. All those people are seeking asylum. They deserve to be heard. That's who we are. We're a nation that says if you want to flee and you're fleeing oppression, you should come.
Well, Betsy, if you're down in Central America or Mexico or the Middle East, is that incentive for you?
Oh, yes. And when you see the number of unaccompanied minors who have crossed the border, it's now 500 a day, thousands and thousands per month. And I raised the issue of unaccompanied minors because they are not being turned back. They are being brought into the United States. They're being held for a few weeks by Health and Human Services. And then almost all of them are teenage boys, 15 to 17. They're being put on buses. They have phone numbers of people who have agreed to be their sponsors, mostly a relative. And they are coming to communities all across the United States and being enrolled in schools.
Right.
And why I'm saying this, because the real crisis isn't just at the border. It could be in your child's school where this child arrives, this migrant child, so needy, in need of psychological counseling, language counseling, everything, you name it, and all the resources that your school would have spent on art and band and extra enrichment programs as your own kids are struggling to get back to school and get back on that learning track will now be diverted to these very needy children from the border. What is he thinking?
Benjamin, 500 kids are crossing every single day now. It's tough to talk about, but sex trafficking is incredibly profitable, and the kids are a lot more profitable. How concerning is that?
It's really devastating, and from a pure human interest sort of perspective, it's horrible to witness. But let's make the point very clearly that this shows that, you know, sort of the best intentions lead to disastrous humanitarian outcomes. So this is not the compassionate policy that Joe Biden sort of messaged during that debate. And when he says this is who we are, President Biden, is it who we are that when we've had an economic crisis, cultural upheaval, and a pandemic to boot, you're going to ask for a surge of individuals across our border to potentially erode our sovereignty? Right. Does that put the American people first? Is that really who we are? And so I think, again, you have to go back to the fact. And then, look, his response this weekend was, please stop surging the border. That was essentially his comment. That's his big defense. If he had just kept the Trump policies in place, even with his terrible rhetoric, which would have caused a spike at the border and a surge, we'd be in infinitely better shape than we are today.
I want to play you a soundbite, Chris, from HSS Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas, basically where he just insults President Trump's policy that was in place up until January 20th. Take a listen.
Sometimes the tools of deterrence defy values and principles for which we all stand. And one of those tools of deterrence that the Trump administration employed was deplorable and absolutely unacceptable.
Chris, your thoughts? I don't know, and I know you've been talking about this a lot on your own show, but I don't know how you can insult the Trump policies that were working just fine up until Inauguration Day.
Yeah, that's the one thing that's infuriating me the most about this whole crisis, how the Biden administration is blaming the Trump administration and saying that they inherited a crisis. Look, with this policy, all they are doing is incentivizing young minors and adults to come to this country. I have sympathy, I have empathy for their plight, but I also think of young African Americans in Chicago and St. Louis who are being gunned down and murdered also. You know, they're saying that these kids are escaping gang violence. Well, there's gang violence here in our country. You know, according to the Centers for Disease Control, the #1 cause of death for African American males 15 to 30 is homicide. We've got a problem here, and we need to start taking care of our citizens here.
You make a good point. It's at record levels in Chicago, but in St. Louis as well. Not a huge city, so it doesn't get the same attention that Chicago does in the Midwest. But you make a great point. I did want to talk about John Kerry for a moment. I'm not sure if you saw this, but he was on an American Airlines flight from the city of Boston down to Washington, and somebody snapped a picture. He's in first class there, obviously. He's got all that ketchup money. And not wearing a mask right there. John Kerry, so our climate czar not wearing a mask. You want to talk about pseudoscience, Benjamin. I don't know what you think about this, but that's a really bad look.
I mean, file this under least surprising things ever. And, you know, of course, John Kerry is the most sanctimonious virtue signaler of them all. He's out there globetrotting around the country while he talks about being, while he is our climate czar, but he has to fly, first class. And this was really a step down for him, flying commercial first class in the first place. But of course, masks are for the little people, and he's got the smug look on his face to boot. Let's remember, this was a Logan Act violator who was negotiating with Iran before this administration. So he should be answering for a lot of other problems beyond just the fact that he flouts the very public health guidelines that I'm sure he says you ought to adhere to the highest standards.
All of that ketchup. I still remember there was a political cartoon, Betsy, in 2004 when W. Bush was running against Kerry, and it was an upset George W. Bush pouring Hunt's ketchup onto his cheeseburger instead of Heinz. And I remember that from years ago. But there's an old saying, don't take showers if you live in a glass house. And John Kerry, the eyeballs are on you right now. You can't do that. Panel, we'll pick this back up at the top of the hour. Great conversation. I enjoyed it. Betsy, Benjamin, Chris, we'll see you guys again very soon.